In the pre-dawn darkness of March 24, 1603, three figures huddled over a corpse within the chambers of Richmond Palace, sworn to absolute secrecy regarding what they were about to uncover. As they began removing the elaborate costume that had defined Elizabeth the Fang for nearly half a century, they unearthed a truth so horrifying that it would be buried with the Virgin Queen, sealed behind lead and lies for more than 400 years. What lay beneath the layers of white makeup and the jeweled gowns was not merely the body of an elderly monarch ravaged by time and poison. Instead, it was evidence of something that shook the very foundations of Tudor legitimacy, Protestant authority, and perhaps even the true identity of the person who had ruled England for 45 years. The official account of Elizabeth's death portrays a serene end, a peaceful passing after a brief illness. According to this narrative, her glorious reign concluded with dignity and calm. Yet fragments of suppressed testimonies, coded letters, and documents that narrowly escaped destruction suggest a completely different story. These hidden records describe a body so corrupted by decades of lead poisoning that the flesh had blackened, decayed, and fallen away in grotesque chunks. They allude to anatomical anomalies that defied all medical understanding of the time. They whisper of discoveries so disturbing that those who witnessed them were immediately separated, bound to silence under threat of execution, and in at least one case, erased entirely from the historical record. The story, however, does not begin in 1603. Its roots stretch back decades earlier, to a time when a young princess first learned that survival in the Tudor court demanded transformation. Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed when Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, beheaded on charges almost certainly fabricated by a king desperate for a male heir. This brutal early trauma impressed upon the young princess a crucial lesson. The female body was both a vessel of power and a source of terrible vulnerability. As Elizabeth grew, she watched her father cycle through wives like a gambler shuffling cards, discarding or destroying them whenever they failed to produce sons. She observed the humiliating spectacle of her sister Mary's phantom pregnancies and the cruel ridicule they inspired across the court. These experiences shaped Elizabeth's decision to transform her own body into something more than ordinary flesh, into a political symbol encased in armor fashioned from lead paint and whalebone. By the time she ascended the throne in 1558, Elizabeth had already embarked on the physical transformation that would come to define and ultimately destroy her. Each day, the Queen applied layers of white lead makeup, known as Venetian ceruse, so thick that observers remarked her face resembled a lifeless mask. This was not vanity. It was deliberate political theater. The unnaturally pale complexion symbolized virginity, purity, and by extension, the uncorrupted Protestant virtue of England, standing resolute against Catholic Europe. Yet beneath this symbolic display, the lead seeped steadily through her skin, accumulating in her bones and organs, slowly poisoning her from within. Over the years, the effects manifested in increasingly horrific ways, eroding both her body and her legacy. The corsets Elizabeth wore were extreme, even by Tudor standards. Reinforced with whalebone, steel, and in some cases even wood, they were designed to force the body into an unyielding silhouette. The lacing was pulled so tight that servants often had to brace their feet against the Queen's back in order to achieve the desired shape. At certain points, the pressure exceeded 80 pounds per square inch, enough force to crack ribs, displace organs, and over the decades permanently deform the skeleton. Elizabeth endured these devices for as long as 16 hours a day for over 40 years. Modern medical analysis of similar surviving garments reveals the toll they would have taken, compressing the lungs, displacing the liver, and inducing chronic oxygen deprivation that slowly weakened every system within her body. The carefully cultivated image of the Virgin Queen served more than one purpose. Politically, it granted her independence in a world where marriage would have automatically transferred her authority to a husband. Remaining unmarried was her shield, her means of retaining sovereignty in a male-dominated court. Yet there may have been deeper reasons behind this persona. During her 20s and 30s, When the pressure to marry was at its peak, Elizabeth often alluded to some unspecified impediment that made marriage impossible. Contemporary speculation ranged from childhood trauma to physical deformity, but the truth remained hidden beneath layers of fabric and cosmetics, concealed until her death. As the years passed, the price of Elizabeth's toxic beauty regimen grew increasingly visible. The heavy lead-based makeup she wore daily began to destroy her skin, leaving behind deep pockmarks and patches of blue-black discoloration. Her teeth rotted, blackened, and eventually fell out, a well-documented symptom of lead poisoning. Embarrassed, she resorted to covering her mouth with her hand while speaking in public. Her once thick hair thinned and fell out in clumps, forcing her to rely on wigs of ever-increasing size and complexity. Beneath the resplendent gowns, her skin developed weeping sores that refused to heal, worsened by the poisonous dyes in her fabrics and the unrelenting pressure of her corsets. The irony was devastating. The very substances and practices meant to preserve Elizabeth's image of eternal youth were the same forces destroying her from the outside in. Mercury-based ointments, used in an attempt to treat the blemishes, caused neurological damage. Belladonna drops, applied to her eyes to make them appear larger and more striking, slowly impaired her vision. She had become ensnared in a vicious cycle, using cosmetics to mask the damage caused by cosmetics, each new layer adding to the toxic burden already overwhelming her body. By the 1590s, Elizabeth's public appearances had evolved into grand theatrical productions. She spent as many as 4 hours being dressed, painted and wigged before presenting herself to her court. Her courtiers were positioned carefully, close enough to be dazzled by the spectacle, but never so near as see the cracks in the illusion. Mirrors were removed from her chambers at her command, for she refused to confront the reflection of her deteriorating body. The Virgin Queen had become a character Elizabeth performed, while the real woman was buried beneath suffocating layers of fabric, lead, and deception. Meanwhile, the carefully worded notes of her court physicians hint at the reality behind the facade, a woman in constant physical distress. Their records describe treatments for mysterious swellings, the application of leeches, and the regular use of purgatives to cleanse what they called corruption of the blood. Behind the magnificence of the crown lay a body relentlessly breaking down, poisoned by the very tools that had once secured her power. One physician, writing in Latin in the privacy of his journal, recorded an encounter in 1592 that still shocks modern readers. While treating an abscess on the Queen's chest, he described finding aberrations of nature that defy God's design. The tissue showed signs of unnatural configuration, and he noted with unease that Elizabeth's body appeared to possess characteristics belonging to both Adam and Eve. His words hinted at a mystery hidden beneath the royal facade, an unsettling truth that could never be spoken aloud. The final decade of Elizabeth's life marked a sharp acceleration in her decline. After a violent illness in 1593, she began to suffer episodes where she seemed to forget her surroundings, speaking aloud to people who were not present, including her long-dead mother, Anne Boleyn. These strange lapses were likely symptoms of lead-induced encephalopathy, yet they were carefully concealed from public view. To maintain appearances, the Privy Council devised an extraordinary system. Stand-ins were dressed in the Queen's costumes and presented from a distance when Elizabeth was indisposed, maintaining the illusion of her unbroken presence. By 1599, her condition had worsened further. Physicians described her as suffering from a great swelling of the belly, possibly the result of a tumor or severe organ displacement from decades of extreme corseting. New gowns had to be designed with hidden panels to disguise her misshapen figure while still preserving the iconic silhouette of the Virgin Queen. The transformation of her face, however, could not be so easily concealed. The toxic cosmetics that had once symbolized purity now left her features ravaged. A Venetian diplomat, who once glimpsed Elizabeth without her heavy makeup, confessed in a letter that the sight haunted him for weeks. He wrote of deep furrows and gaping holes across her face, and a complexion turned blue-grey like unto a corpse. The year 1602 brought fresh horrors. Elizabeth suffered what appears to have been a series of strokes. Her speech grew slurred, her left side weakened, and most humiliating of all, she lost control over her bodily functions. Special garments were fashioned to conceal the accidents. While attendants prepared her for appearances as though she were a puppet, she was painted, dressed, and positioned, with handlers discreetly ready to hold her upright should she falter. By the winter of 1602-1603, Elizabeth was little more than a living corpse. Physicians recorded the appearance of putrid ulcers upon her legs, which released such a vile stench that servants were forced to burn herbs constantly to make the royal chambers bearable. These ulcers turned gangrenous, the flesh rotting even as she still clung to life. Strange growths appeared across her body, described as like unto barnacles, possibly tumors, possibly grotesque reactions to the toxic substances that had been coursing through her system for decades. Her final months were a grim spectacle. Elizabeth's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would stand rigid for hours, refusing to sit or lie down, claiming that if she did, death would seize her instantly. She refused food, as ulcers in her throat made swallowing agonizing, and when she forced herself to eat, she vomited blood and what her physicians called black bile. Her body wasted away, the padded garments, masking a skeletal frame that could no longer support the burden of her crown. Yet the most closely guarded secret of her final weeks was something far more grotesque. Physicians discovered what they referred to in coded Latin as monstrum in corpore, a monster in the body. Near her left breast, a growth the size of a goose egg had formed, purple-black with visible veins that pulsed of their own accord. When lanced, it released blackened blood with a metallic stench. Some whispered it was cancer. Others speculated it was a parasitic growth. The most disturbing reports, however, claimed it contained what looked like hair and teeth, suggesting it was a teratoma, a monstrous tumor that embodied the darkest irony of all. The Virgin Queen's body had birthed something unnatural within itself. March 23, 1603, brought the final crisis. Elizabeth was seized by a violent convulsion that lasted nearly an hour. Foam, streaked with blood, poured from her mouth as attendants watched in horror, powerless to intervene. When at last the fit ended, she lay motionless for so long that many believed death had already taken her. Then, in a moment of chilling clarity, she whispered to Robert Cecil, "I am tied with a chain of iron about my neck. The case is altered with me." These words, cryptic and despairing, marked the beginning of her final hours, hours that remain shrouded in secrecy and dread. Accounts of Elizabeth's death diverge wildly. Some claimed that her body twisted itself into impossible positions, as though bones and sinews no longer obeyed natural law. Others swore they heard strange sounds emanating from within her body, noises that could not be explained by human anatomy. Dr. Richard Manningham, present at her bedside, later recorded a detail too disturbing to dismiss. The skin did seem to move of its own accord, as if creatures crawled beneath. When death finally came, it was not the serene passing of a Christian queen, but the violent expulsion of something that clung to life with desperate force. The official time of death was entered as 3:00 in the morning, March 24th. What followed immediately after would become one of history's most carefully guarded secrets. Her body was swiftly wrapped in sackcloth before rigor mortis could set in, then placed in a lead coffin, sealed shut without delay. No death mask was taken, no lying in state permitted. The few witnesses to these events were sworn to silence under threat of execution. Only 3 individuals were allowed to prepare the body: Dr. Manningham, Lady Helena Sneckenborg, and an unnamed minister. What they discovered beneath the Queen's garments necessitated one of the most sweeping cover-ups in royal history. As the layers of clothing and cosmetics were removed, the grim truth was laid bare. Her gown had fused to her skin, bonded by dried blood and pus. The corset she had worn for decades had embedded itself into her flesh, the whalebone stays pressing so deeply against her ribs that they had to be torn free. When finally pried away, Chunks of necrotic tissue came with them. The rib cage itself was grotesquely deformed, lower ribs forced inward and upward, compressing the internal organs beyond recognition. Her liver had been displaced into her chest cavity, and her stomach was reduced to a fraction of its natural size. The organs revealed within were blackened and withered, showing unmistakable signs of catastrophic damage from decades of lead exposure. When the famous mask of white makeup was at last removed, it revealed skin laced with a web of blackened veins, forming intricate, unnatural patterns. In places, the lead had eaten so deeply that holes ran straight through to the bone. Even the skull bore evidence of the poison. Sections of bone softened, warped, and thinned, as though melted from within. Most shocking of all was a soft spot at the crown, like an infant's fontanelle, which physicians reported had pulsed with its own unnatural rhythm. Yet the most closely guarded revelation lay in the examination of the lower body. Here the witnesses confronted the secret that may explain Elizabeth's lifelong virginity. The sexual organs were neither wholly male nor wholly female, but a disturbing amalgamation of both. The external features were ambiguous, suggestive of a disorder of sexual development. Where one might expect an opening, there was only scar tissue, ancient and sealed long ago. The womb, when inspected, was shriveled like a dried plum, riddled with calcifications. This revelation raised immediate, devastating questions. Was this the impediment Elizabeth had hinted at in her youth? The hidden reason she never married? Or did it suggest something even more shocking, that the ruler of England for 45 years had not conformed to the rigid categories of gender upon which Tudor society rested? The implications were staggering. If Elizabeth's identity did not align with the legal and religious frameworks of the age, then what of her reign itself? Could every law passed, every noble created, every treaty signed be called into question? The secret was too dangerous to ever be revealed. Dr. Manningham's private account described discoveries so unsettling they bordered on the impossible. Upon dissection, he recorded finding anatomies that defied the natural order, organs misplaced, tissues connected in ways that no medical knowledge could explain. He noted what appeared to be a second, smaller heart, lodged near the stomach, lung tissue strangely embedded within the abdomen, and even bones in places where none should exist. The brain, examined through a careful incision, revealed extensive damage from years of lead exposure. Within its folds, Manningham discovered small hardened nodules which, when cut open, contained objects resembling tiny pearls, or perhaps eggs. The blood, drained from Elizabeth's body, only deepened the horror. It was not the familiar dark red of mortal flesh, but a viscous black fluid, metallic in sheen, thick as tar, and stinking of rotting metal. When this substance touched silver, surgical instruments, they tarnished instantly. More disturbing still, fragments of the blood seemed to move of their own accord, crawling across the examination table before finally growing still. The examination of the spine revealed extreme scoliosis, compressed vertebrae, caused by decades of corseting, yet also bony protrusions unlike anything in human anatomy. From several vertebrae jutted horn-like growths, covered by skin that had thickened into a scaly, almost reptilian texture. Together, these grotesque anomalies painted the portrait of a being that had either transcended or fallen beneath the boundaries of normal human physiology. Manningham, Lady Helena Snakenborg, and the unnamed minister faced a dreadful choice. To reveal their findings would mean shattering the fragile legitimacy of the Protestant succession. It could plunge England into civil war and hand Catholic Europe a weapon of divine propaganda, proof, they would claim, that the Protestant Queen had been cursed by God himself. The three witnesses chose silence. The body was entombed in secrecy as much as in lead. Elizabeth was wrapped in multiple layers of sackcloth before being sealed within a lead coffin, which itself was encased in another coffin lined with mercury, bound in chains, and marked with sacred symbols. No public rituals, no prolonged lying in state. Her body was hidden swiftly and permanently. The witnesses were separated at once and forbidden from speaking or writing of what they had seen. Manningham was dispatched to Scotland under an assumed identity. Snakenborg vanished into a convent, bound by a vow of silence. The minister disappeared entirely from record, as though erased from history. Every trace of contact with the Queen's remains was eliminated. The clothing was burned, the examination table destroyed, even the floorboards stained by her unnatural blood were ripped up and replaced. A systematic purge followed. Physicians' notes vanished. The accounts of ladies-in-waiting were confiscated, and private letters referencing the Queen's health were seized. The official story was scrubbed clean. Elizabeth, it was declared, had died peacefully after a brief illness, her body showing only the natural signs of age. Yet beneath this sanitized version lingered the whispers of legend. The notorious Bisley Boy story claimed that Elizabeth had died in childhood and been replaced by a male substitute. Historians have long dismissed the tale as fanciful myth, but the physical evidence described by Manningham lends it unsettling plausibility. The ambiguous genitalia, the masculine bone structure, the abnormal arrangement of organs, all aligned disturbingly with the possibility that Elizabeth was biologically male or intersex. The extreme measures taken to hide her body, both during life and in death, take on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Elizabeth herself may have hinted at the truth in her most famous declaration, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." To her contemporaries, these words proclaimed courage. To modern readers, they may carry a double meaning, perhaps even an admission of physical reality. Her lifelong refusal to permit physicians to examine her below the neck now seems less like modesty and more like the careful guarding of a secret that could unravel the kingdom. Modern medical speculation offers several possible explanations. Severe lead and mercury poisoning could have induced grotesque mutations over decades of exposure. A chromosomal disorder may have influenced her sexual development. A teratoma, a monstrous tumor containing hair, teeth and bone, might have grown and spread throughout her body. Some researchers suggest complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, in which a genetically male individual develops the outward appearance of a woman. Others point to congenital adrenal hyperplasia, a condition that produces ambiguous genitalia and masculinizing features. Whatever the truth, the hidden body of Elizabeth Tudor remains one of history's most disturbing enigmas, an enigma wrapped in lead, locked in silence, and buried beneath centuries of lies. The sealed tomb in Westminster Abbey has never been opened for modern examination, despite numerous requests from historians and scientists. The British government repeatedly refuses such inquiries, invoking respect for the deceased and the need to preserve historical monuments. Yet many suspect the motive runs deeper than ceremony, a profound fear of what might be discovered. Elizabeth remains unique among English monarchs in that her remains have neither been examined nor moved. Recent non-invasive investigations using ground-penetrating radar have revealed anomalies within the tomb's construction: multiple lead layers, unusual voids, and metallic signatures consistent with chains or additional barriers. These physical irregularities line up disturbingly well with contemporary accounts that describe extraordinary measures taken to seal her body. Further study of Elizabeth's surviving clothing corroborates these reports. X-ray analysis shows garments modified in ways that suggest efforts to conceal physical abnormalities, with extra padding in precise areas, unusual structural reinforcements, and repeated alterations designed to accommodate a changing body shape. Chemical testing of objects the Queen handled has produced alarming results. Items bearing her touch contain extraordinarily high concentrations of lead, mercury, and arsenic, levels far above what cosmetics alone would explain. Hair samples taken from her wigs show lead burdens sufficient to cause severe neurological damage. Makeup swabs from her personal collection register lead concentrations that, if ingested, would have been immediately lethal, yet she applied these compounds to her skin every day for decades. Taken together, the forensic and documentary evidence paints the portrait of a person living under the weight of a massive secret. Elizabeth's famous virginity, her stubborn refusal to marry despite relentless political pressure, her obsessive privacy about her body, and her furious responses to any challenge to her authority, all read as measures taken by someone protecting a dangerous truth. Her oft-quoted declaration, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king," might contain more literal truth than metaphor. The success of the cover-up was astonishing. For more than 4 centuries, the reality of Elizabeth's body has been concealed. Witnesses took their knowledge to the grave, documents were destroyed, and private records were seized or erased. A sanitized history was written in their place. The Virgin Queen was transformed into a symbol of English greatness, an image curated to inspire awe rather than provoke horror. Yet fragments of the suppressed truth endured. Lady Snackenborg's encrypted journal, decoded only in the 20th century, speaks in chilling terms of seeing not the sovereign's body, but something that wore her shape as a disguise. Dr. Manningham's medical notes reference conditions that should have been impossible in God's creation. The unnamed minister left behind a single cryptic entry in his Bible, "I have seen proof that the devil can wear a crown." These scraps of testimony, combined with modern forensic hints, keep the mystery alive, an unsettling reminder that beneath the pageantry and rhetoric of empire, a human body was bound in lead and sealed in silence. Would you like me to combine this with the earlier rewritten sections into one continuous narrative, polished and seamless, so the whole piece reads as a single forbidden chronicle? God forgive us for what we have hidden. The implications extend far beyond Elizabeth herself. If the person who ruled England for 45 years was not who they appeared to be, then what does this mean for the legitimacy of every decision made during that reign? The establishment of Protestantism in England, the legendary defeat of the Spanish Armada, and even the early foundations of the British Empire, all of these monumental achievements were guided by a ruler whose very identity may have been a fabrication. The mystery deepens further when considering Elizabeth's relationships. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and her closest confidant once hinted that she harbored a secret capable of shaking the very foundations of Christendom. Mary, Queen of Scots, wrote cryptically that Elizabeth was less than a woman, more than a woman, something between and beyond. For centuries, such remarks were dismissed as political insults or rhetorical flourish, but in light of the physical evidence revealed after her death, they take on an unsettling weight of credibility. Financial records from Elizabeth's household also raise suspicion. They show recurring payments to a special tailor for garments of highly unusual construction, purchases of excessive amounts of cloth, and frequent compensation for craftsmen skilled in making devices designed to alter or disguise the human form. While these expenditures could be attributed to the extravagance of royalty, they may also document the creation of elaborate physical disguises. Foreign ambassadors left behind their own impressions, and though couched in the polite language of diplomacy, their remarks hint at oddities. Many noted Elizabeth's unusual height, her broad shoulders, her deep voice, and her masculine mannerisms. The Spanish ambassador described her as bearing the presence of a man in woman's clothing. The French envoy remarked upon her hands, rough and broad like those of a stonecutter, and her stride steady and commanding like a soldier. These observations, though subtle, suggest that Elizabeth's physical traits stood out even in an era with very different standards of beauty. Elizabeth's own writings also speak to a deeper struggle. Her poetry, filled with imagery of masks, disguises, and veiled truths, may have been more than metaphor. One haunting passage reads, "I am not what I appear to be. The face you see is not truly me. Beneath the crown and royal array lies something that must hidden stay." Scholars long interpreted these lines as allegorical reflections on monarchy and duty, but when reconsidered in light of what was hidden after her death, they may represent something closer to a literal confession. Her lifelong medical symptoms also align with conditions that could explain the bizarre discoveries made at her autopsy. Chronic lead poisoning would account for many of her ailments: tremors, seizures, neurological decline, and skin deterioration, but it cannot explain the structural and anatomical anomalies. Genetic conditions affecting sexual development, such as androgen insensitivity syndrome or congenital adrenal hyperplasia, could explain ambiguous genitalia, yet not the presence of additional organs or strange growths. The discovery of what may have been a teratoma complicates the picture further, suggesting her body may have carried growths or tissue anomalies from birth. Some researchers propose Elizabeth may have suffered from multiple conditions at once: a chromosomal disorder influencing sexual development, combined with decades of lead and mercury poisoning, producing grotesque mutations, and possibly complicated by a teratoma or similar growth. This convergence of rare factors could have created the impossible anatomies discovered in her final hours. Her toxic beauty regimen, laden with lead, mercury, and arsenic, would have been dangerous for any human being, but for someone with fragile genetic conditions, it may have proven catastrophic. Would you like me to take all these rewritten parts, including this one and the earlier ones, and weave them into a single polished narrative, formatted as a continuous historical exposé? That way, it will read seamlessly from beginning to end, like a forbidden chronicle. The extreme corseting Elizabeth endured throughout her reign could have worsened any underlying skeletal abnormalities, compounding the physical toll of her condition. At the same time, the immense psychological strain of maintaining such an elaborate deception may have accelerated the mental deterioration observed in her final years. Yet the most haunting question remains: if Elizabeth was not what she seemed, when did the deception truly begin? The Besley Boy legend offers one possibility: that Elizabeth died in childhood and was replaced by a male substitute, but there is another, perhaps more plausible scenario. Elizabeth may have been born with ambiguous physical characteristics that became increasingly pronounced with age. This would have forced her court and physicians into desperate, escalating efforts to preserve the appearance of femininity. The heavy use of toxic cosmetics, once adopted for beauty, may have gradually become a necessity, masking not only age, but also the emergence of masculine traits that threatened her carefully crafted image. The smooth succession of the crown to James VI of Scotland is itself suggestive. Despite decades of political tension, the transfer of power occurred with remarkable ease, hinting at powerful forces determined to prevent scrutiny of Elizabeth's legitimacy. James himself may have known truth withheld from the public: his swift orders that Elizabeth's tomb never be disturbed, his destruction of many documents from her reign, and his generous pensioning off of her closest servants under strict vows of silence, all suggest a man ensuring certain secrets would remain buried forever. Even more curious is the response of the Catholic Church. For decades, Rome had branded Elizabeth a heretic and bastard, condemning her at every opportunity. Yet upon her death, Catholic propagandists were strangely muted. Some historians argue this silence was not mercy, but part of an unspoken arrangement, perhaps a bargain struck with James. In exchange for Catholic tolerance, under the new king, the Church may have agreed never to reveal what it knew about Elizabeth's body. If true, this silence suggests that even Elizabeth's enemies considered the truth too dangerous to be weaponized. Modern forensic science could, at last, resolve the mystery. Her lead-sealed coffin, if opened, would likely have preserved her remains in astonishing condition. DNA analysis could establish her genetic sex, reveal chromosomal abnormalities, and detect congenital disorders. Chemical testing could confirm the levels of lead, mercury, and arsenic in her tissues. Skeletal examination could prove or disprove the deformities described by witnesses, but each proposal to examine the tomb has been denied, the official explanation being the preservation of historical integrity. Many suspect the real fear lies in what might finally be uncovered. For now, we are left only with fragments, the whispered testimonies of those who risked everything to record what they saw. The physical clues embedded in her surviving clothing and artifacts, and the conspicuous gaps in the official record, where silence speaks louder than words. Together, these fragments sketch a portrait of a figure who transcended or defied the boundaries of ordinary human categorization, a ruler who maintained an impossible deception through willpower, poison, and the complicity of all who understood that truth itself can sometimes be too dangerous to reveal. Ultimately, the story of Elizabeth's body is about more than biology or medicine. It is about the price of power and the staggering lengths to which individuals and institutions will go to preserve foundational myths. The Virgin Queen, celebrated as the embodiment of English virtue and Protestant destiny, may in the end have been neither virgin nor queen in the traditional sense, nor even fully human as her people believed. Would you like me to now weave all the rewritten parts into one continuous narrative, so it reads seamlessly like a single forbidden chronicle of Elizabeth's life and death? The body that came to symbolize an entire nation's identity was itself a carefully constructed deception, corrupted and transformed by the very efforts intended to preserve its image. What lies sealed in Westminster Abbey is not simply the remains of a monarch, but the possible evidence of one of history's greatest cover-ups. The Queen, remembered for her defiant declaration, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king," may in truth have possessed a body that was anything but ordinary. Elizabeth, who refused marriage and cited a mysterious impediment, may have been shielding a secret so profound that its revelation could have destroyed not only her reign, but also the legitimacy of the English state itself. The process of transformation from living flesh into symbolic icon came at a terrible physical cost. The lead she used to preserve her pale visage slowly poisoned her bloodstream. The mercury prescribed to treat her blemishes eroded her mind. The arsenic in her cosmetics ate away at her skin. The brutal corseting she endured for decades compressed her ribs, displaced her organs, and deformed her skeleton. Layers of magnificent clothing and carefully applied paint concealed not only the ravages of time, but also increasingly grotesque mutations beneath. By the end of her life, what remained of Elizabeth was barely human, a fragile, decaying frame painted into the likeness of eternal youth. She became a grotesque parody of femininity, a monster wearing the mask of a queen. Yet perhaps the most unsettling revelation is not what Elizabeth became, but what her transformation reveals about power itself. The monarch's body, long believed to be sacred and inviolate, was in reality corrupt, poisoned, and possibly fraudulent. The Virgin Queen, symbol of purity, was in truth hiding decay and deformity. The Protestant icon, celebrated as a divine blessing, may instead have embodied evidence of a divine curse. These contradictions were known, documented, and deliberately concealed, because revealing them would have shattered the fragile fictions on which government and society depended. The truth was witnessed by only three: Dr. Richard Manningham, Lady Helena Sneckenborg, and an unnamed minister. They bore witness to a reality that challenged their understanding of nature, divinity, and sovereignty itself, and they chose silence over revelation, opting for stability, order, and the survival of the crown, rather than unleashing truths that could have torn the kingdom apart. Their silence shaped 4 centuries of history, allowing the myth of Gloriana to endure while the grotesque reality rotted inside a lead-sealed tomb. Even today, Elizabeth remains undisturbed in Westminster Abbey, her secrets protected not only by layers of lead and stone, but also by law, legend, and national identity. The Virgin Queen has become so deeply entwined with the story of England that the revelation of her body's reality would be traumatic even in the modern era. The woman who once declared, "I have no desire to make windows into men's souls," has had the window into her own body and identity permanently shuttered. The mystery endures because it must. Some truths remain too dangerous to confront, some myths too essential to dismantle. Elizabeth herself may have understood this better than anyone. By transforming her body into a political statement, she transcended mortality. She became immortal not in spite of her body's corruption, but because of it, the ultimate alchemy, where weak and poisoned flesh was transfigured into the enduring symbol of a nation's greatness. As we close this unsettling investigation into one of history's darkest secrets, we are left not with answers, but with questions that may never be resolved. Was Elizabeth truly who history claims her to be, or was she the greatest illusion ever performed upon the English people? What remains in her coffin, truth or legend, still waits in silence, sealed beneath stone and myth, a riddle that perhaps must never be solved. Was Elizabeth truly who she claimed to be? What was the real nature of the body hidden beneath the layers of lead paint, cosmetics, and royal regalia? What discovery was so dreadful that it required the complete erasure of evidence and testimony? The answers remain sealed within Westminster Abbey, protected not only by the walls of stone and the weight of history, but also by centuries of silence, bound together by the unspoken understanding that some secrets are better left buried. The terrifying secret of the Virgin Queen, uncovered after 4 centuries, is not a single revelation, but a cascading series of horrors. It tells the story of a body destroyed by toxic cosmetics, a skeleton warped and deformed by the constriction of regal clothing, organs that seemed to defy nature, blood that challenged natural law, and sexual characteristics that disrupted the binary understanding of gender. Overarching all these mysteries was the possibility that the person who reigned over England for 45 years might not have been Elizabeth Tudor at all, but someone or something entirely different. This was the price of myth-making, the immense cost of sustaining illusions of power. Elizabeth sacrificed her own body, surrendering her physical self in order to be transformed into a symbol of divine rule and national strength. Yet in death, that very body threatened to unravel everything she had constructed. The secret was buried with her, sealed in layers of lead and cloaked in silence, a truth too terrifying for Tudor England to confront. Even now, 4 centuries later, it remains a truth too dreadful to face. The Virgin Queen endures as legend precisely because the reality of what she became, or perhaps what she always was, must never be fully disclosed. In the end, perhaps Elizabeth's most enduring triumph was not her victory over the Spanish Armada, nor the establishment of England as a rising world power, but the complete mastery of her own image. She so carefully controlled the perception of herself that even in death, even as her corpse displayed impossible horrors, she ensured that those revelations would be hidden and suppressed. Elizabeth's final victory was not over her rivals, nor over the challenges of her time, but over truth itself. The tomb in Westminster Abbey does not merely enshrine a monarch. It stands as a monument to the power of secrets, to the necessity of myths, and to the terrible price demanded for maintaining illusions. Inside, wrapped in layers of lead and guarded by the legends that grew around her, lies evidence of a transformation so complete and so horrifying that those who beheld it chose to erase it from history rather than allow it to be revealed. There, in the darkness of her sealed tomb, the truth about the Virgin Queen waits, patient, unyielding, and terrible. A secret that even after 400 years remains too dangerous for the world to know.